the idea of the footprint. This is just a 2x4 with a groove in it. And now the nailer has a much smaller footprint. So if you can reduce the footprint of everything that is possible to reduce its footprint of on your shelf, you'll get a lot more on there. You could have an entire pile of saw blades all the way up to the top of the shelf, but then you can't get to any of them. So this was what I did with my 8s, 10s, and 12s. This system is really cool, and I'll show you why. But also in this video, I'm going to extend this prototype to make a 7 1/4 version that's a more permanent caddy. I started to rethink how I should organize my saw blades from this. Yes, it's an old table saw guard. And what it is all my oddball masonry and metal blades. And I started thinking, when they're standing upright, they're way easier to get to. And that led to this. Right now this is set up to accept 12-inch blades on this side and 10-inch blades on this side. And what's great about this design is that I can add to either side whenever I want, depending on how many blades I have. So rather than taking you through building this, it'll be self-explanatory to you if I show you how to add a couple slots. In my case, I'm going to add a couple of 10-inch slots on this side just because I have a couple of 8-inch dado blades, and even though they're a little smaller, they fit well into a bigger slot. Starting out at the table saw, we're going to rip some strips of plywood. I have the fence set to 3.5 inches, and I'm using 2 types of plywood. The first is 3/8, which is the material that I'm using for the divider walls themselves. The second material is a 1/4 inch floor underlayment, and this stuff is used for the slot. We'll be cutting an arc into it later. All of these pieces can be cut to length at around 11.5 inches. This is just a rough cut though, it's not that important, and you can also dress these up later on by sanding them. And what I cut out for the 12-inch was this much. This is what sets the size for everything. It's about a 1/2 inch away from the ends and a 1/2 inch away from the bottom. This is what you would take out for 10-inch, and of course the 7 1/4 is an entirely different design, which we'll get to in a moment. Okay, to determine the size, take your largest blade, put your compass point in the center of it, and make the compass's lead stick out just a little bit past the tooth, just so that the slot doesn't end up too small for the blade. And of course, you can just trace what you've already made to make future ones. At this point, we have to screw all the parts together, which is easy enough, but you have to be careful not to hit the screws that you used to screw the last set of parts together. So I'm marking them all out, and once I know where the screws were from the last time, I can be sure not to hit them this time. Sanding is optional, but come on, it's so satisfying when all of those pieces of plywood are all exactly the same. Does that make me crazy? Maybe. But I still like it. Once it's fully loaded, it's heavy, so there's no way that it's going to tip over. Even if there's only one blade on it, it's large enough that it doesn't tip over. And there is some play, and so they will touch, and I'm sure some of you will complain about it, but really, if you're putting these in the back of your car to take them on a joyride, I really don't know what you're doing. These are going on a shelf for me, and It's really nice. You can select whichever one you want. And this sure beats having a pile, because if you have a pile, effectively you're using the 3 blades on the top. Next up, it's just a 2x4 with some slots, but there's some rather tricky slots. Here's a cutaway of one of these slots, just so you can understand what's going on here. I just kind of guessed to find center when I did this, but ideally you want about 3/4 of an inch from this point to this point. So just kind of tinker around until you get your blade centered, and then clamp your sled down so it can't move. This knob sets the height on my table saw blade. Take note of its position. It's facing down. And so a certain number of turns with it always facing down will produce a consistent height of cut. I know that if I crank it down 7 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it's down below flush. And if I go 7 back up, then I'm making the exact same cut again every time. Now there's only one other thing to worry about with this, and that's how do we space these out easily. And it actually is easy. A piece of masking tape, and now we'll just mark every 1/2 inch. One 1/2 inch away from each other is a pretty nice spacing, because you can still get to it without cutting yourself. At this point I'm halfway there, and I don't want to keep going because I'm just not too keen on the idea of having my hand right over top of the blade. So what we can do, use your combination square, set it until it gets to this cut. And now, when we put it on this side, that distance from here to the cut is how much I still have to cut off of the length here in order to make this exactly symmetrical. Be right back. Now that should be close enough to being centered for what this is. So now I can just start at the beginning of my marks again. And there you have it. I found an acceptable balance between footprint size and accessibility, at least for this one small corner of this shelf. Some of you will no doubt ask, why do you have so many? Aside from the fact that different sizes go in different machines, this being the most common size, the 7 1/4, I use it primarily as my table saw blade. Now I know my table saw is a 10-inch saw, but I find that a 7 1/4 is cheaper. You can always have a sharp blade in it, and it's safer. I highly recommend using this. But also you'll have some that are new, some that are ruined, some that are weird. Different blades have different purposes, and there are quite a few different types in here. This one has a high number of teeth, so it's good for expensive plywood so that it doesn't tear it apart. And that's what happens when you pay more attention to the camera shot than to the outfeed roller.